On today's show, we are taking our first trip to Westeros and talking all things Battle of Winterfell. A special Game of Thrones edition of Blockbuster Breakdown starts right now. All right, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another edition of Blockbuster Breakdown. Thank you so much for joining me on today's show, talking all things Game of Thrones for the first time in this show's existence. I've wanted to do Game of Thrones for a while, but as we know, there's been a gap in the seasons. We had no new episodes or anything new from Game of Thrones in 2018, and that's when the bulk of this podcast was going on. And I wanted to do an episode this season. I didn't get to do ones for episode 1 and 2 just because of scheduling conflicts and all that stuff, but I'm excited to talk about this episode because this was the longest episode in Game of Thrones history. This was perhaps the biggest budgeted episode, and some would call it the best battle we have seen so far in the show's history. That's right, Game of Thrones episode 3 from season 8, titled The Long Night, but should be titled The Battle of Winterfell, because that's exactly what this was. Now, I know this show is primarily for talking about movies, but the title of the show is Blockbuster Breakdown, and we talk blockbuster media in this show. So while we haven't talked TV just yet, we have done TV news stories before. We define blockbuster on this show as any movie, TV show, or anything that has that mainstream appeal and is typically based on extensive source material. A movie or TV show or anything that the trailers alone make you go, I need to see this right now. And I think Game of Thrones checks off all those boxes, barring the fact that it's not a movie. But this episode might as well have been a movie, as it was an hour and 22 minutes long. We had a huge battle, and if you condense the first 2 episodes of setup into, say, a first act, these first 3 episodes would play out like a solid 2.5-hour movie if you were to condense it down. So this is definitely one of those episodes that fits that blockbuster definition and definitely falls into that genre that I can definitely talk about it on this show. And yeah, we're just going to get right into it with a brief synopsis of the episode. And the brief synopsis goes: The dead are here. After tearing through the wall, the Night King and his army of White Walkers have arrived at Winterfell for their first test in their ultimate quest to restore Westeros into the Long Night. Dothraki, Unsullied, Starks, and even 2 Lannisters embark in their biggest battle yet that will threaten their very existence as they attempt to defend Winterfell and Westeros with it. All right, so this episode had a lot of hype going around it. The first 2 episodes of this season were pretty slow, I would say, but that wasn't a bad thing for me. A lot of people complained that the first 2 episodes didn't have enough action, especially when we are having our shortest season yet with only 6 episodes in this entire season. But I appreciated the first 2 episodes because a lot of people felt before seeing this episode that it needed to be slow and we needed to smile with our characters and enjoy the time we have left with them, because we really don't know how much time we do have left with them. And as looking back on those episodes, some of those came true while others did not as much. Some characters that I expected to perish in this episode actually did survive, which obviously is not a bad thing, but it was a good way of false knowledge going into this episode. I thought for a fact that Grey Worm was gone because he laid out his future in the previous episode, and I thought anyone who lays out their future before a big battle, they're bound to die, just to emphasize that emotional weight to their untimely death. I thought Jaime was gone in this episode because I thought his arc had come full circle. He had gone from being the snobby Lannister, the Kingslayer, the Oathbreaker, to completely redeeming himself, coming all the way to Winterfell, saying, I would have done what I did before in a heartbeat because I'm loyal to my family and I'm loyal to my cause, and I will be loyal to you. And even though they want him executed, obviously Daenerys wants him gone because he killed her father, Rhaegar Targaryen, the Mad King. Regardless of how he acted, that's still her father at the end of the day. And we see him with Bran. He's the reason Bran is crippled. But nonetheless, he came to Winterfell to fight, and he was nice throughout. He knighted Brienne of Tarth. He gave her final wish. I thought Jaime was definitely going to perish in this episode, and I'm kind of glad he didn't, because it makes it more unpredictable for who will eventually take down Cersei, because the prophecy says it's going to be her brother that takes her down. And so far, all the prophecy has come true. It said that she will have 3 children and they will all die. All 3 of her children are dead. And it said that she will, wear the crown, but she will be taken down by her brother. So rather than have Jaime perish in this episode and have it just basically be a given that it's going to be Tyrion, now we don't know if it's going to be Tyrion or Jaime, or if the prophecy is even going to come true. Maybe it's just coincidence that the other aspects have come true so far. But nonetheless, we get into this battle, and after all that's set up, the army is lined up. At the end of episode 2, we hear the horns blaring, which is the 3, which means, a threat beyond what they're capable of. But the armies are lined up. They're prepared. They have lines of soldiers all lined up. They have the first row of defense, and then we have more towards the back. Dothraki at the front, unsullied later on, and then we have the trench with spikes and everything ready to be defended. And our first character that appears on a horse, at first I thought it was an undead horse and it was someone like a White Walker coming to confront them, but no, it was the Red Woman. It was Melisandre. And even though she is someone that can't really be trusted, she tells, I believe it's Jorah, she tells him to, do you speak their tongue? Tell them to lift their swords, and they do. And she ignites their swords, which is a scene that's really cool because we see it from Jon Snow's perspective as he sits atop of the castle and he looks on, and we basically see a wave of swords getting ignited. And it was a very cool visual technique because they send that first line of defense to charge at the White Walkers, and we don't see what happens. We don't see them die, but what we do see is all their blades slowly get snuffed out until there is none left. And we're basically 10 minutes into this episode told how much of a threat these White Walkers are going to be. And I thought that was a very cool visual technique to use. And some retreat, and then we eventually get the White Walkers arriving. And this was overwhelming. I mean, they arrive in droves. They're obviously mindless creatures that are only loyal to the Night King and obey his commands. And it felt very much like World War Z, if you guys have seen that movie. 2013, Brad Pitt. Very underrated movie. Unfortunately, the sequel that was supposed to be written and directed by David Fincher, I believe, that apparently is no longer in production. Nonetheless, it reminded me, a lot of the visual cues reminded me of World War Z because they're kind of like running and crawling on top of each other. So when the White Walkers arrive to the battle line with the army that's defending Winterfell, it really feels like a wave of White Walkers. It's not your typical clash that you would have when, we've seen in the Battle of the Bastards, Hardhome, the Season 2 battle with the Greek Fire. It's not your typical swords on swords clashing. It's really just these mindless creatures that are just tossing themselves on top of each other, trying to, win this war, and they dominate this battle for the most part. I'm not going to get into any of the deaths just yet. I'm just going to recap the episode, and then we'll get into the Fallen and what it means and all the cool callbacks and all that. So when they arrive, they're taking out so many of the soldiers that are defending Winterfell, so much so that a lot of the wounded have to retreat and get back into the castle, to treat their wounds because they're in no shape to continue fighting. And a lot of them, even though they talk a big game in episodes 1 and 2 about how they want to fight and defend, a lot of them, this is a threat that they haven't seen and a threat that strikes fear, into their very core. And it makes a lot of them retreat even if they aren't completely wounded because essentially they just fear these White Walkers, and you kind of understand the threat as soon as they arrive. Eventually, they're pushed so far back that the trench has to be ignited, which wasn't necessarily a plan because they didn't really have an idea to have Melisandre come in, and they start shooting arrows at the trench, but they all get snuffed out. Obviously, we are in winter. Winter is here, and the flaming arrows aren't enough to ignite the trench, so Melisandre puts her hand on one of the pegs and starts saying that spell, the same spell actually that Beric Dondarrion uses to ignite his sword, but because he's so one with the Lord of Light, he only has to think it. He doesn't have to say it. So obviously Melisandre, we know how old she is. The necklace is just putting on a front to make her appear young when really she is very, very old. So her strength probably isn't what it once was. And so she has to say this command a lot, but eventually it works and she ignites the trench, and it kind of, the fire goes across, and we have a standoff between the White Walkers on one side and those defending Winterfell on the other. And it is very reminiscent of Season 7, Episode 6, when Jon Snow, and basically the Magnificent Seven episode, like I like to call it, which is when it was Season 7, Episode 7, I believe, actually, when Jon Snow, Jorah, Beric, everyone goes to capture a White Walker to prove to Cersei, and eventually they're trapped in the middle of the frozen lake, and all the White Walkers are just surrounding them, just staring at them, staring through their soul, really imbuing fear into their opponent. And it reminded me of that, but obviously with a different artistic technique, because we have fire rather than ice separating them. And so it was very ominous to see through the flames the White Walkers just staring at their opponent. Moving over to another battle, we get Drogon and Rhaegal, being ridden by Jon Snow and Daenerys against Viserion being ridden by the Night King. Now, this was a really, really cool battle. Very Godzilla-like, in the sense that a lot of times in these Godzilla movies, these big blockbuster monster movies, we see the monsters above the clouds and really showing that they're these godlike creatures. They're otherworldly, and there was a time when Drogon and Rhaegal were above the clouds and hovering above them, and it was just a very visually appealing shot, very artistic. And we would see the Night King rise from the clouds, breathe that blue fire, and really imbue that fear into Drogon and Rhaegal. And he gets the upper hand for a while, but eventually Drogon and Rhaegal fight back, knocking the Night King off. And he's on the ground, and Daenerys gives the command, Dracarys, basically to burn him alive, shoots the flames at him. It goes on for so long, and the music cue kind of gives you the sense that this isn't the end of the Night King. The flames go away, and our first and essentially only expression of emotion from the Night King happens here, as he gives this sly little smirk because he's left unfazed, because regular fire can't destroy him. I believe it's only blue fire that can actually kill him, or Dragonglass or Valyrian steel, as we will later see. And we move on to the Godswood with Bran by the tree and Theon defending him. And Theon he puts the team on his back. Okay, Theon gives 120% this episode. I believe that Theon took down the most White Walkers. I think it's between Arya and Theon, as they really got their shots, their montage shots of them taking out a ton of White Walkers and all that. But yeah, Theon is doing everything he can to defend Bran, and he eventually runs out of those flaming arrows, and the White Walkers have surrounded, and everyone else there to defend Theon has already fallen. And to defend Bran, has already fallen, and Theon just kind of looks, and he goes to charge at the Night King. The Night King and his fellow White Walkers, the ones that are ice guys like him, are on their horses, I don't believe they're on their horses actually at that point. I think they're just standing with him. And the Night King goes to confront Bran. Earlier in the episode, Bran did go under, and he took some ravens. He took their eyes and flew with them. I really don't know what the point of that was. Bran is the most confusing character in Game of Thrones, as he doesn't show any emotion. He's just kind of very meta and just goes with the flow and just kind of just says whatever. And sometimes it's badass, like when he says to Jaime, "The things we do for love," and that's such an oh shit moment from episode 2. But this one, he does give some good lines that I will get into in the callback section of the episode. So after that, the Night King goes to approach Bran and confront him because he's already killed Theon. He stabs Theon through the chest. He blocks